So now we're going to start to define our game scene in a little bit more of a systematic way. Now, before I do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you would delete content from the scene view or from the hierarchy inside Unity. It's not it's one of the least intuitive things. I think our instinct would tell us to select the object and hit delete. And you'll discover when you do that, the object does not disappear. And the reason for that is that there might come a time when you want to map the delete key to some kind of user input or some kind of function. And Unity doesn't want to interpret that as deleting whatever you have selected whenever you do that. So we have the option of right-clicking on an object inside the hierarchy and choosing to delete. Or we can hold down the command key and hit delete. And by the way, whenever I mention the command key, it's the command key on the Mac, and typically the alternative for the PC is the control key. So when I say command delete, you can just substitute the word control if you're using a PC. I'm also going to get rid of the sphere, just so I'm starting from my default scene. So I'll command delete and get rid of that object. And I'm just going to recreate a new game object. I'm going to go to 3D objects and choose a cube. Now, instead of leaving this labeled as cube, I want to rename this object, and I want to get in this habit early on that when we generate objects inside Unity, we want to name them as soon as we create them, because we're going to create these scenes. There's going to be a lot of content in our scenes. It's going to be so much easier if we stay organized and name these objects. So there's a couple of different ways that I can name an object. The first way is that if I right click on the object in the hierarchy, you can see that I can choose the option to rename, and when I rename, the object gets highlighted. I'm going to deselect that. Alternatively, if I select the object in the hierarchy and then click one time, left click on the title, that will highlight it and allow me to name it. I'll just deselect that. I'll select it one more time. And finally, if I have the object selected, if I go over to the inspector and I go to the top of the inspector, you can see that the object title is here. And I'll just change the name of it here. I'll call it floor. And I'll hit return to apply the name change. And now you can see that in the hierarchy, that name has been updated. Okay, so this cube is going to represent the floor of the game that I'm creating. And so the first thing that I'll do is I'm going to go to the transform field. I'm going to find the scale value, and I'm going to scale this in a way that I want its width and its depth to be scaled, but I'm going to leave its height or its y-axis to remain the same. And so in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to option drag and orbit. And so now I'm looking at this object. The Z, or the blue axis, is kind of pointing back in space, more or less. I'll orbit this a little bit more. The x-axis is more or less pointing left and right, and the y-axis pointing up and down. So I'm kind of oriented, I'm still in a perspective view. I can see over here at this widget that things are reminding me of which axis is which, and it's okay if you immediately don't recognize the color of the axis, but we do want to start to understand what the X, Y, and Z of the axis is. If I go and modify the value of the X axis, and I'll just type in something like maybe 20, you can see that the object gets updated according to its red axis. So the red corresponds to the X. I'll do the same thing for the Z. I'll type in the same value that I did for X. And I'm just going to use my mouse wheel, and now I'm going to zoom out a bit. I'm also going to pan and change my view just a little bit, and maybe I'll orbit, but now you can see that I have a basic, what I'm referring to as a floor object for my game scene. And this is going to, kind of be the platform for which all things function in this game. So I now have my floor. If I don't like the design or sort of the dimension of this, I can also take the Y or the height down to something like 0.5 or maybe 0.2. So I can use decimal points. I don't have to stick to whole numbers here, as you can see with the position here. Now the position, at some point I must have been kind of dragging something around. I wasn't paying attention exactly to how I modified the position, but I'm noticing that the position of my floor is not quite in the center. It's not a bad idea at this point. I'm just going to zero out the X. I'll hit the tab key and zero out Y and Z. And so now I know that that center of that object is exactly in the center of our 3D space. And that'll be helpful to kind of keep things oriented, because as we create objects and they're off in space, we're going to want to get a sense of where they are relative to the rest of the objects. And that'll become more intuitive the more experience that we get inside Unity. But for now, I have a basic floor object. So now I'm going to create another object. I'm going to go to Game Objects, Create Other, and I'm going to create a sphere. Now this sphere, you'll see that when I created it, it's kind of being intersected by this plane, and so I'm just going to take it by its y-axis and lift it straight up. Now I'm going to lift it up and off the ground for a bit, so it's kind of hovering above the ground, and I see this shadow. The shadow is giving me a sense of, give me a little sense of the volume and the dimension in the space, and so I can kind of start to see, get a better relationship of where these objects intersect. But if I look really closely, if I move this down, I see this green bounding box around this object, and eventually if I start to see that disappear or become cropped by the surface, I know that those objects are intersecting. So I want to make sure that I lift that up only according to the y-axis to kind of get it up and off the ground so it's floating in space. Now this is the thing that I'm going to add some physics to, so it's going to fall to the ground and be taken over by the gravity inside Unity. Okay, so this whole project, there's not going to be any user input at this point in the project. The whole project is going to run as a gravity simulation. So the way that I get gravity to work inside Unity is that we're going to talk to the physics engine. And we'll do that in just a bit. Before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the camera and the scene view inside Unity. Now at this point, we've been operating exclusively inside our scene view. And our scene view is just the place that as designers we look to arrange our content, to author content, to modify the art and the light and its arrangement in space. But when we run our game, when we run our simulation or whatever it is that we're creating, we're going to enter a different mode of Unity. And what we're going to do is that we're going to end up looking through our main camera. Now, if I select my main camera, you can see that my main camera is selected. Now I don't see the main camera in my scene view because it's somewhere off to the side. But if I look down here at the bottom right hand corner, it's giving me a preview of what my camera is seeing. Okay, so if I go up to the top of my Unity scene window, you can see there's 3 buttons that line the top of the Unity interface here. The first button is play. This is going to be a button that we use quite regularly. There's pause and advance, and these 2 buttons we're going to want to avoid pretty much this entire class. We do not want to press those 2 buttons. I only want to toggle the play button off and on. So if I go up here and I hit play, Unity left the scene view and now entered the game view. Okay, and I can see that my play button is on, and this is what our game looks like. Not very exciting at this point, it doesn't do anything, but we're looking through our default camera and we're looking at the game that we've created. Now I'm going to go back up and I'm going to toggle the play button, and now we go back to the scene view. Now what's happening is we're switching from our scene tab to our game tab, and if we look up here at the top of our scene window, you can see that we have a scene tab, and to the right of that we have our game tab. When we hit the play button, we're doing 2 things. One, we're inheriting the game tab, so we're looking through our game, or excuse me, we're looking through our camera, whatever our default camera is, at our game, and then we're running any simulation and any programs that we have or scripts that are attached to our objects inside of our game. I'm going to go back to my scene view. It's very rare that we'll ever want to click on the game tab to look at our game. The way that we're going to do this is we're always going to hit the play button. We hit the play button, we look through our camera, we run any simulation or any interactive objects that are inside of our scene. At this point, we don't have any. When we're done and we want to modify, go back to authoring our content, moving stuff around, we want to make sure that we toggle the play button and go back to our scene view. Now, I'm clicking on the play button at this point to enter that play mode or run the simulation. And in fact, there's a better way, which is to Command P on a Mac. Okay, Command P. That will toggle the play button. So I'm now looking at my game, and I'll Command P to turn it off. And that's the way that I'm going to play our scene or play our game. Okay, so let's experiment with that. Set up a floor, set up a sphere, make sure that the sphere is relatively in the center of our world here, but lift it up off the ground and experiment with the play button. Now, once you get used to that process of toggling the play button off and on, I do want to point out that we've spent a lot of time at this point, creating our game inside Unity, and we haven't saved anything. So I want to make sure that we do that. Now, when we save, we're inside Unity, inside this authoring interface, and what we want to do is we want to save scene. So I'm going to choose File, Save Scene. Now, we can save scene or we can save scene as. I haven't saved anything yet, so I can simply do Save Scene or Command S. And when I do, a window is going to pop up and ask me where I want to save this. Now, I want to let the location default, but I want to save the scene as, I want to give this a title. Now, this scene exists within a project folder, Gravity Lab. And what I'm working on is the first level of my project. Now, this project's only going to have one level, but the naming convention that I prefer to use for all games, and I'll recommend that you do this as well, is I'm going to call this LVL, short for level 01. So it's level 1 of our game. Okay. Now, if I were working on level 2 and 3, I could increment these and save these as I go. But for this project, I simply want LVL1, and I'll hit save. Now, when I create level 1, you can see that down in our project folder, in our assets, we now have an LVL1 project. So this level contains all of the assets inside the hierarchy and all their position and all of the content that went into the creation of that level. So this is the way that we're going to save the current scene that we're working on. So take a few minutes, build the floor, build the sphere, lift it up in space. Make sure that you get used to the idea of toggling the play button on and off to change from game mode to scene mode. We'll talk about the implications of all of that during the next presentation.